everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on today's training, using data to tell the stories of our immigration programs, reframing how we think about, speak about, and use data. This training is offered through IRC's Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Assistance, or META project, which is supported by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And we're so happy to be presenting in collaboration with Catholic Legal Immigration Network, or CLINIC, today. At META, we are working to build the capacity of refugee service providers in the U.S. to collect, manage, analyze, and use data to improve outcomes for our clients. My name is Meg Gibbon, and I'm the Program Officer for the META project, and I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Jeff Chenoweth, who is CLINIC's Director of Capacity Building within the Center for Citizenship and Immigrant Communities, which helps nonprofits start, expand, and sustain charitable legal immigration services for low-income immigrants and refugees. Jeff has extensive experience in nonprofit immigration services at the local, national, and international levels, and currently he's supervising attorneys and staff who work with affiliates to expand their program management and direct legal services. Before we get into our objectives today, I'll take a few minutes to go over some logistics in this WebEx platform. Those of you who are using phone audio can click on the Event Info tab for dial-in number and code at any time. And at the moment, everyone is on mute. I expect that we'll have a fairly large group on the line today, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. So please, to ask a question during our dedicated Q&A period, you can click on the hand raise icon, and we are happy to open up your line. Or at any time throughout the presentation, click on the chat bubble on the top right of your screen, which will open up the chat window, and then you can send a message to me, Meg Gibbon, or everyone attending. So you have that option, and as well, there's also a Q&A tab at the top right as well. You can type a question in there, and that will give us an opportunity to type out an answer, make it public to everybody. Later on today, we'll also ask for your input a few different times during a poll. So when a window pops up with a poll question, all you have to do is select the answer and then click Submit. So keep an eye out for that. Our objectives for today's session are that by the end of the training, you'll understand the benefits of reframing, monitoring and evaluation, and reporting as telling a story. And then secondly, that you'll be able to understand 5 steps for using data to tell a story about immigration programs. And I do want to mention as well that although our lens today is immigration programs and specifically immigration legal services, I know we have a wide variety of attendees with us who may not be working directly in that field. So we've developed this training with the intention that each of our 5 steps can be applied to any type of program. And we'll also be sharing a tip sheet along with this webinar recording that is general to all programs. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned, in this session, we are going to reframe how we think about monitoring and evaluation and reporting in order to use data more effectively. So rather than talking about these ideas as activities we're only doing for donors, we're advocating that you reframe the discussion and talk about how data collected through M&E answers questions that can enable us as program staff, as service providers, to tell factual stories about our programs in order to facilitate decision-making and action. But before we get into that, let's define monitoring and evaluation just to ensure that we're on the same page about these terms. So what is monitoring? Many of you I know are familiar with this term in the context of donor visits to your grant programs, or headquarters visits to maybe a particular site to check about grant compliance. So what we're talking about here is actually a broader definition of monitoring that includes compliance monitoring but goes beyond this. So the process of regularly collecting, managing, and analyzing information about a project in order to adjust or shape project implementation as needed throughout the lifetime of that grant or of that project. While grant compliance monitoring is certainly critical, we advocate that monitoring be conceived a little bit more broadly to really include all the activities you do during the lifetime of your program, to rely on your data, answer questions, and discuss collaboratively as a team in order to learn about your project as it's ongoing. So, what does this look like? Again, we're talking about a collaborative, ongoing discussion. The focus is on the use of data, shifting away from collecting data just for the donor towards taking action on data in order to improve our program. So some of the questions you might ask as part of your monitoring are questions like, are we meeting our targets and benchmarks? If not, why aren't we? Are project activities being implemented as planned? Are we reaching the people we intended to reach? Are there people that we are not reaching? What action do we need to take based on this data that we're seeing? Do we need to adapt this project and change it? So overall, in this case, what we're talking about is strong monitoring as foundational to data-driven programming. And then what's evaluation? So this process refers to the collection and analysis of information, typically once or twice during a project. So for example, at the end of a project year or at the conclusion of a project, in order to look back and assess the project outcomes and the factors that influenced results. Together with monitoring, you'll hear evaluation referred collectively as M&E, so monitoring and evaluation. And I'll take a pause here to open up a poll, if you'll just bear with me for one moment. So go ahead now in the polling window that you will have just seen pop up and answer this question. I know there are certainly many reasons to collect data, but if you did have to pick one, what's the most common reason you collect program data? Is it to report the data to donors, to analyze the data, use it to improve your program, to communicate about your program to others, your partners, your community members? And I did give an answer choice at the end here, other combination, in case you're unable to choose. But if that's the case, just type out in the chat what are the two choices that you're torn between. Great, thank you, everyone. I'll close that poll now, and in a second I'll show you the results, but it looked pretty split. We had a pretty even division between the second and third choice as the most common. So, excuse me, the first, second, and third. Let's see, let me just show you this here. So one thing I wanted to stress in conducting this poll here is, of course, that while reporting data to donors is critical, it certainly makes sense you're required to do that. Donors need to see the data on programs that they are funding. It's equally important, and in some cases maybe even more important, to be using the data to understand and improve your program, and then to use that data to communicate about your program to others that are interested in learning about it. And so that's sort of what we're going to begin talking about next. So why think about M&E and reporting from this lens of telling a story? So, we feel there are a few benefits to this reframing, and the most important one is probably that it helps us keep the focus on purpose. Why are we collecting the data we collect, and how is it meaningful? What will having this data actually enable us to do? Will it, let us test assumptions about our program? Will it help us make decisions about how to improve it, communicate about our program to others effectively? Some of those things that we just talked about. And then using this framing just as a general backdrop for talking about why we are doing data collection, monitoring, and evaluation can help minimize intimidation associated with, even with the words M&E themselves, with data, with analysis. Certainly to staff and those of us who may not have a strong background in these areas, they're not necessarily the most approachable topics, but really talking about M&E and reporting as activities we do in order to gain information, answer questions, help tell the stories of our work is something that, everybody is certainly able to get behind. And then lastly, because reframing these activities as telling a story, it keeps the focus on the right data, right? So it can help you collect the correct data that you actually need, structure and present that data in a way that's useful, so in your data management system and in your data visualization, and then again, use it effectively. So these are just a few of the reasons that we have identified that can help explain why thinking about M&E and reporting from the perspective of telling a story is a useful idea. So soon I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to get started on the 5 different steps that we walk through today related to using data to tell a story. But before I do, I wanted to just call out 2 important tools that can help you accomplish those 5 steps. I know, again, many of you are familiar with these terms, but a theory of change is a type of logic model that defines all the building blocks that are required to bring about a given long-term goal. They certainly don't always look like this, but they are providing this graphic representation of the change process, explicitly illustrating causal pathways, using arrows so you can clearly see how activities are leading to your outputs, which then in turn lead to outcomes, to your objectives, etc. And you may see different arrows going different directions. They may not always be a linear results chain like we have here, but essentially the process of developing a theory of change helps you just plan out and articulate what your program intends to do and how it intends to do it. It can also just be a discussion tool that provides a framework to think through what stories you want to be able to tell with your data. What did your theory of change hold true, and can your data show that indeed your activities led to the outcomes you had planned out? If it didn't, is there changes that you do need to that program? So this is just a foundational piece of using data to tell a story. And then a log frame is another type of logic model, but in this case it uses a table or matrix to summarize the key elements of a program strategy. So again, activities, outputs, outcomes, objectives, but in this case, you're also specifying the indicators you're going to use to measure each of those, the means of verification or the source of that data, and then any assumptions that are necessary for project success. We like to advocate that you develop a theory of change first, which will include, smart outputs, outcomes, and objectives that can then relatively easily be transferred into a log frame that outlines more specifically how you will measure each of those things. We won't talk too much about how to develop theories of change or log frames today. Meta does actually have e-learning modules on each of those if you want to go into that topic more deeply, but I will say that filling out a log frame which draws on a strong theory of change can not only help make sure you're collecting the right data and that all of your staff are seeing that data as meaningful, clearly linking the indicators you're using to what you are tracking and why, but it helps structure that data for reporting and then communicating the stories that you want to tell. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Chenoweth. Again, Jeff is the Director of Capacity Building at Clinic, who's going to walk through the first few of our steps today. And he's going to provide some examples of, this in practice, these 5 steps in the case of immigration legal services. So if that isn't your area of focus, again, we anticipate that these steps can be relevant to a variety of programs. So I will hand it off here to you, Jeff.
Hi, everyone. As Meg mentioned, I'm going to kick off our 5 steps for using data to tell a story. I know that not all of you are delivering these types of programs, but I hope that immigration legal services resonates as just one example of services we provide to help refugees and immigrants integrate and succeed in the United States. So did you know that most immigrants begin their integration experience in the U.S. by obtaining a visa for employment, study, joining a family member as an asylee or refugee? Without a visa, most immigrants are just hoping and knocking on the door. Therefore, it is important to consider immigration legal services as part of the immigrant integration process, particularly as we help immigrant families join or reunite, prepare people with work authorization, and help them become U.S. citizens. So step 1 is, in this 5-step process, is define your monitoring and evaluation questions. What are the stories we want to tell? Why and to whom? So at this early stage of planning, staff should consider which people are the target of your storytelling, stories that are true and compelling about your outcomes. Possible audiences for these stories might include executive leadership in your own organization, the people who see you each day but may not know what you are accomplishing on a large scale, your board of directors, your funders. Maybe your audience is local leaders who make important decisions about immigration and integration, media, employers and business leaders in your community, etc. Who are your audience? And once you decide your audience, think about what is their special interest in your immigration work. If it is employers, then maybe they are interested in a workforce that is ready for employment or advancement. What is your agency doing to prepare people for employment, and how successful are you? If your audience is funders, then what does the funders' board of directors care about as stated on their website, in their application for funding, and in the other organizations they fund? Maybe the funder is interested in youth and preparing young people, including immigrants, for successful school performance and graduation. If so, What does your immigration or refugee program do to provide youth with this type of support, directly or indirectly? Maybe your program provides parents with employment, stable incomes, stable housing, adult literacy, and parent-to-teacher interpreter services. These contribute to student success in addition to being a mentor or a tutor to a student. Maybe your target audience are people who are interested in immigrant integration, particularly through the lens of legal services leading to naturalization and U.S. citizenship. So start connecting the dots backwards from your target audience's interests to the questions you have about your own program so that you can find the data that helps you to answer these questions and tell your stories. So undoubtedly, your program produces many outputs and outcomes, maybe too many to track consistently or to tell stories about. Therefore, we need to choose the questions carefully. You may want to look at questions that you can consistently answer from year to year so you can show growth over time and tell more stories about. Remember that you can tell a successful story about your program's outputs, how many trainings delivered, clients served, those are outputs, activities, but a story about how your clients' lives have changed for the better is the story that most people outside your agency want to hear. People are going to connect more with your client stories because these are the people who are in need and live in their city. So when seeking to monitor and evaluate your services, you want to ask not only did we deliver services as we said we would, but what outcomes of our services were achieved? What changes have occurred in our clients' lives? So here are some important questions to ask about your immigration legal services, using that as the prime example today as part of our data collection and then telling your success stories. For example, what need in the community does our organization fulfill? Let's say your agency has an immigration legal program with attorneys or Department of Justice accredited representatives. Maybe these are people who were once refugee resettlement caseworkers and now they're legal representatives. These are the people who are authorized to practice immigration law. You may want to know how many other immigration attorneys are there in town and what do they charge, and how many other nonprofit immigration legal programs are there in town. What percentage of all charitable legal representatives in the county do we employ? What's our ratio? How long are waiting lists to access the legal services? Collecting this data can help us demonstrate, for instance, that we are meeting a need for affordable, accessible legal services, and that we have no difficulty finding clients. And as such, we are vital, we're important in helping low-income immigrants achieve their dreams in the United States. Another question is, who uses our services? You may need to know the answer in terms of nationality, date of entry to the U.S., their immigration status, age levels, gender, zip code, income. Who's needing our services and what are their characteristics? And these data points can help paint a fairly clear picture of your clients. Also, what services are they seeking from your program? And then why did they choose your program instead of going elsewhere? That's an important story for you to tell about why your program is so vital. It's good to ask people, why did you choose us? And another question is, to what extent are our services available or affordable? Can you tell this story in two different ways, one positive, maybe one negative? Here's an example. You can look at your data and say, we accept 90% of persons who seek our immigration legal services. Our services are consistently lower than the private bar because we are charitable. We are able to approve 80% of people who seek fee waivers for our services. That's a positive statement about your availability. Or you can make the same statement in the negative. You can say, without our immigration legal program, 250 people would likely be unserved. The possible result is that 120 families might remain separated, 80 people less likely to become U.S. citizens. So you can tell your story sometimes in a negative just to show what would be the truth if your program didn't exist? Here's another question. Do we consistently refer certain cases elsewhere due to lack of capacity? If you must refer people elsewhere for any service, legal or otherwise, this should be documented so the data can be analyzed and explained. If you refer out often and wish to provide such a service, then this data helps you make the argument to your leadership and potential funders. For example, we have to tell everyone in our program seeking asylum to go elsewhere at great expense because we have no one capable of representing asylum cases in our agency. You would want to document that and show the numbers and the frequency and where you refer people to if you want to start providing that service. And then, are services being delivered efficiently and according to best practices? Funders and other social investors expect you to do your job and to do it well. That is a burden the nonprofit sector always carries. How do we tell our supporters that we're good at what we do and that we're efficient with their money? For example, we might look at what percentage of our budget is invested in training to ensure high-quality services. We might also ask, to what extent do we follow standards required or recommended by the Council on Accreditation, the U.S. Department of State, Office of Refugee Resettlement, your National Voluntary Agency, your State Bar Association, clinic, if you're a clinic affiliate. All of these organizations have standards, and then if you're following them, then your stakeholders should know that. That's a story about your professionalism. And to what extent do we implement best practices, such as in the legal immigration field, clinic has a 100% ready rule or standard. And that standard is no case should be opened until the prospective client for your legal services is 100% eligible. That's a fact. 100% ready with all their documents, and 100% paid for your services if they are paying for your services. If they have to go and get documents to prove something, you really don't want to open the case and count it as open when it's not even ready. So we call that a rule of efficiency. So, and then of course, what are the outcomes of our services? We'll look at this in more detail in a few slides later. So over the next few slides, we'll walk through an example or a question, thinking about how we can go through each of our 5 steps to use data to tell a compelling story. Let's take a question mentioned on the previous slide and make it as specific as possible. What immigration legal services do refugees in our area need and why? So why is this useful? You see this chart on your screen. You have the example question I just read. Now we're asking, why is this useful? Why do we want to answer this question to tell a story? What decision can be made based upon the information? Well, maybe we will want to use this data to make the necessary staff available to provide immigration legal services to refugees and create a budget to support the staff changes. For example, a lot of refugees have to navigate their own legal immigration needs, particularly if they're secondary migrants and they move away from their resettlement agency. They may not know that the refugee staff actually do green card applications or I-730s or work renewals or even naturalization. They may drift around. So maybe we want to explain why this information is useful about where our refugee clients go. So who is our audience for this example? Let's take some of the target audiences we mentioned earlier. Maybe the people interested in this are program staff, potential funders, legal representatives in other agencies. So remember, we're working based on the interest of the audience to get the data we need. So step 2 is determine what data can be used to answer these questions to tell a story. Now that you have a sense of what questions you're going to answer, why, and who is your audience, you'll want to think about what data can answer those questions. Where is the data? What is the data? As said earlier, there are many data points to collect and analyze in your important work, perhaps too many data points. Therefore, think seriously about what you want to voluntarily track when you don't have to, but you want to, and what you have to track to make for good stories. And we've spoken about a few regarding employment, English language, obtaining green cards, becoming citizens. And all of these are important hallmarks of integration. What's your favorite data point and why? If it's important to you, it might be important to your supporters. You just need to connect the dots for them. Remember, the data is best when it can be evaluated year after year to show growth and improvements. It doesn't also have to be collected by you personally. There might be other ways to collect the data. So don't feel like you are the only person just because you're on this webinar, that you have to be the one to collect it. So collecting and keeping, for example, client emails, cell phone numbers, and other important contact information helps in the data collection process, especially if you're trying to get qualitative information that's not in your database, and we'll talk more about that in step 3. So let's take a look at some examples of data you may want to track in the legal services arena. There is often data you already collect that you can use to answer your questions about your programs and then communicate your stories. For example, is demand for our services increasing? Are we seeing growth in our programs? We might use the number of applications completed from year to year to show how there is an increase in demand for our services. Can you show diversity and complexity from year to year? Well, what data might you use for this? Probably nationality data and types of cases that you're providing legally to show the diversity and the complexity of the cases. Fee waivers, how much money are you saving low-income immigrants by providing them with charitable-based services? For example, if a private attorney charges $1,500 for an application for naturalization, but you charge $200 because you serve low-income people, then theoretically you've saved each applicant $1,300. Multiply that by 50 clients a year, and that's $65,000 of hard-earned income saved because of your program. Now that's an important story to tell. So going beyond applications filed, look at the number of approvals and then start looking at the outcomes of those approvals. Just telling a stakeholder or a funder, we filed these many applications, it really isn't the best story. It's really about the approvals and then what people do with that status. So when it comes to naturalization data, you may be looking at the number of consultations for naturalization and the number of individuals eligible and not eligible, but could become eligible if additional services were provided, like English classes. And then you might look at data, why are people applying in the first place? Start asking at the consultation intake process why your client wants to become a citizen and why now. So these are two compelling data points with a story attached. They answer what services do our clients need and what are the driving factors behind them wanting to be U.S. citizens now. So another good story to tell is how many people who want to become citizens need your English language and citizenship classes to pass. Data we might use to tell this story might include how many people not ready for naturalization due to language barriers are able to pass our citizenship class, and how long did it take them to pass? So then you can count the percentage who went on to actually become citizens, and that's good data. The number of people who took your class, who had language barriers, who would not have been able to have passed without your class, they passed your class, and then they became citizens. It's a really good sequence of data points there. And then, are you tracking how many refugee families are reunited as a result of immigration legal services? You know how many refugees you've resettled, you report that, but do you know how many refugee families were reunited because of legal immigration services? Do you know how many families, as a result of reunification, now have 2 income earners instead of 1? That's a big story. Can you give examples of how income grows in a family when reunification occurs? and particularly when the second adult in the family gets a job. And then what do they do with their income? Do they buy a house, maybe? Well, if so, that's a significant integration story to tell. So to answer our sample question of what immigration legal services do refugees in our area need, we might track number of clients assisted with, say, adjustment of status from refugee to lawful permanent resident, green card holder, the step before becoming a citizen. Maybe 80% of your refugee clients are served with one-on-one appointments with an attorney or a Department of Justice accredited representative to get their green card application finished. Maybe you also use the group application workshop model to serve 20% of your refugee clients applying for a green card. Say that the group application workshops are held every quarter with staff and volunteers assisting on a Saturday at a community center where, on average, 95% of people who come with their documentation complete get the application done. You can document how many staff hours it takes to do one application and then calculate the cost of that staff hour. The same can be done for helping former refugees apply for naturalization. In this way, you've documented need, your approach, the scale, the frequency of your approach, the efficiencies you use, like the workshop model, using volunteers, and then the outcomes, how many applications were filed and approved. And so this is just a way of looking at your refugee population through the lens of legal immigration services, seeing the various data points that are available to you that might help answer questions about what is the need in our community, why is it useful to them, who are the clients that use our services, and why do they come to us, and what do we provide as outputs, but then what are the outcomes that happen in our client stories. So when serving refugees to become green card holders, you can ask how many plan to become U.S. citizens, and you might track this and their reasons why. And then another thing to consider is the number of clients assisted with the application for naturalization, their gender, their age, their nationality. Those are very interesting data points for funders. It tells you who's in the community, who are our future citizens. And here you may also be curious to see if more than one person from the same household is applying at the same time or has done so already. Or is this person the first to apply for naturalization in their family, but there are 3 people who are also eligible? That's a very important data point. So we know that one person naturalizing often inspires others in the same family or household to do the same. Step 3, now that you know what data you need, the next step is to think about where that data can come from. This may be data you are not currently tracking, or you may have the information already. In many cases, we don't need to do additional data collection. We can just better organize the data that we have. When it comes to immigration legal services, here are some possible sources of data which one might use to answer different questions for different audiences. For example, the first on the screen is fee schedule. You can calculate how much you are saving low-income immigrants with their services, how much money they can keep for their own household expenses, like I said earlier. If you're saving someone $1,300 when they apply for naturalization, what can they do with that $1,300? Another data point, source is your intake forms. Those forms can ask anything you want since you designed them. You don't want the form to be too long that nobody wants to use, but think about just the core questions that will help you to tell a more compelling story. Include what is most important to you to collect from year to year to show those positive changes. And remember that the intake form can collect qualitative data if you come up with closed-ended answers that are standardized for retrieval and analysis. For example, why did you choose our services? And you can have some closed-ended options to make it easier to study. So another source of data in the legal field is government receipts and approval notices that are logged into your database to help you track what cases are now active, approved, denied, or delayed. You can show productivity by tracking the notices that the government sends after applications are submitted. So you can see we have 300 open cases active. We have been closed 25 already in the first quarter. By the end of the year, we should be closing 150, showing again volume of service. And think about the receptionist, your front desk person who might refer people out for services, and maybe she doesn't track where they're going, where she referred people. It was just a phone call, goodbye, hang up. That's a missed opportunity to track important data. The receptionist can also ask people to answer how they heard about your services in the first place, and then track where she sent them if services can't be provided in-house. And then hopefully you have client satisfaction surveys in different languages on paper and online that can be used to explore not just if they like you or not, but what are they going to do with their benefits once you help them. Funders should be impressed by high client satisfaction rates. So think about, do we do a client satisfaction survey? Is it in multiple languages? Is it on paper? Is it also online? Are we asking people what they will do with their benefit, how they think their lives will be improved? Do you have a way of analyzing that data? And again, it doesn't have to be you that does it. It could be even a volunteer that likes this idea as a very important community activity. Then lastly, another data source is your revenue and expense sheets. If you manage your budget, if you see the monthly reports of revenue expenses, funders should be impressed when you can provide high volume services with positive outcomes and show efficiency as well. Keeping within budget. That's a very important story to tell as a nonprofit manager. Referring back to the chart on the screen, now what is our data source method? Of course, approved permanent resident status applications give us good data points. For example, asking why someone wants to become a citizen is an important question, as I've mentioned. You should also be able to track basic data that is found in every application, say for naturalization, if you're using an online case management system that allows you to do reports. For example, the naturalization application has the nationality. Well, if you're using a case management system for all your N400 applications, you can do a report. How many Burmese are we helping with naturalization? How many Iraqis are we helping with naturalization? You can call that data out of your immigration legal case management database. How many people are we assisting with all immigration services who live in this zip code as opposed to another zip code? Maybe you have clients who are in 2 major immigrant-impacted neighborhoods. You can show how you are serving both communities well, or maybe you can say, we are not in the right location. We probably should have a sub-office across town. So there are a lot of data points in your case management database if you're using one to complete immigration legal forms. So next I want to turn to the question of how output data, your activities, which we mostly focused on so far, differs from outcome data, output versus outcomes, which outcomes can be often more compelling in telling your story. Too many times we like to speak about our services that we do on a daily basis as outcomes, when in fact we're really talking about outputs, our activities. Outputs can be defined as the products, the goods, the services, the short-term results that we produce, like completing an application. That's a short-term, really short-term output, not so much an outcome. But outcomes can be defined as the planned or achieved results of our services, changes that can contribute to the client's overall well-being. In case of immigration legal services, An output might be filing a naturalization application. The outcome is the approval or the overall approval rate of all your naturalization clients, 95% maybe. Even so, that outcome is to be expected if we're doing our jobs well. Is it a big deal to say 95% of our naturalization applicants become citizens? Yes, but shouldn't they already? Is that really the big story? We can go further. We could say of the former refugees who naturalize, you might want to say X% of our clients register to vote. X% apply for family members to join them in this country, or X% use their citizenship to get better paying jobs. So saying 80% of clients have registered to vote as a result of our program is a stronger outcome story than simply saying you filed X number of naturalization applications last year. It just takes a little more effort to collect this data and then to tell it. So let's look at another example, but this time focusing on a question and indicators related to project outcome. What are the outcomes of our naturalization services, for example? Again, approval rates are more interesting than number of applications filed, and what people do with their naturalization is even better than approval rates. So it's helpful to consider asking clients when they take the oath of allegiance, what are they planning to do with their naturalization? And are they registering to vote? Are they applying for a family member? This is just very interesting data that I think funders are more interested in because it tells a bigger story. So I think for our next step, I'm going to turn it over to Meg.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And here we're going to take a moment to open another poll. So I'm wondering here as we get into step 4, how frequently do you visualize your program data? We've given just 4 options. Do you visualize it always or often? You know, for example, using a visual dashboard. You know, maybe you only visualize it sometimes, rarely, or maybe you don't visualize it at all. So I'm curious if you don't mind answering the poll in the next, give it maybe 30 seconds. All right, great. Thank you. I'll go ahead and close that now. You know, we were split before on the previous poll. This one is actually even more split. It's almost a complete 3-way tie for the first 3 options here, which is great to hear that many of you are always visualizing your data using something like an automatically updating dashboard, and that many of you as well are creating visuals for presentations and meetings. And then I also see that some reported that they only rarely visualize their data, which is also common when visualization is seen as an added step or an additional step when it's not necessarily built into the data management system that you have. And so something we're going to talk about in the next few slides is a way to make this data visualization process, which is so critical to using your data to tell a compelling story, a really baked in, easy process that will just be, you know, something you can dedicate some time to do once and then have ready for you quickly when you need it. So step 4 here, you know, we talked about identifying questions, identifying the necessary data to answer them, and then the necessary sources of that data. We also encourage you at this stage to plan how you would like to present that data. So yeah, I don't know, it may seem odd to think about how you want to present data even at this planning stage. You know, after all, you don't have the data yet to present. You know, we may not consider that until the reporting stage when we're looking back and summarizing the data for a donor or for another, you know, another audience. But thinking back to step 1, which was identifying your M&E questions, where we spoke about the audience, where we spoke about the importance of considering audience, who are we telling that story to. In order to effectively reach them, you need to consider from the beginning the way you want to do that, the way you want to share that data with that individual or with that group. So thinking back on that intended audience, what is the most effective way to convey your data to them so the story will be understood? This is going to vary for different audiences. You know, for example, presenting information internally to your project team in a staff meeting is going to look a little bit different than presenting it publicly. And so let's look at a couple examples that demonstrate this. So here's a kind of typical program data table that you might see for a naturalization program. But when it comes to data visualization, many people believe that a table like this is actually among the worst ways to visualize data. Readers are not easily able to parse this type of table. I don't know about you all, when you looked at this, how quickly did it take you to understand how well is this program doing? You're really going to have to read through and understand that. It's going to take you some time. It might be okay for a report or a situation where you have space limitations or no other options, but for external audience and even for donors where possible, there are better ways to visualize this information and think about how we can use this information to tell a compelling story. And it's not that hard to do. So here's one way. This is the same information that you just saw. Hopefully it is much clearer how the program is doing based on those data points. Same targets and actuals are here presented in what's called a thermometer chart. It's actually a variation on a basic bar chart. It's just done in Microsoft Excel, and we do on our website have a post about how to do this. But while this type of chart makes clear that our program exceeded all our targets, and in some cases they met the target, this graph may actually not be appropriate for certain audiences either, right? So it's all about what that audience is looking for. Your donor may be very happy to see that the targets you proposed were, reasonable targets and you achieved them, but others don't care what your proposed targets were in the first place. They just want to know what you did. And so I'll take a look at another example, again using the same data. In this case, this visualization might be more appropriate for a general audience or, a community member that is just interested in learning about your program. You can see that there are a few of the same principles that we followed on the past chart. The title is making the message abundantly clear. There's no way to not understand what the point of this chart is, because rather than titling it Program Outcomes, we are giving you the bottom line right at the top. As a result of our services, 179 New Yorkers became American citizens. That's as direct as it can be. In this case, we are only including information that's relevant to this particular audience. So compared to the previous graph, we removed more technical language, such as LPR and 400. We're using words that are going to resonate with the general audience. So often you may be considering avoiding terms such as beneficiaries and clients, which may be less accessible than a word like a job seeker, students, new Americans, new neighbors. In this case, we kind of went with a local angle, 179 Californians became citizens, right? Could be an option depending on your location. And then we're using an accent color to highlight the most important information, sort of keep it simple as possible for the audience. So again, I recommend checking out the Meta website for more data visualization resources, and we also provide technical assistance on this if you'd like to work together on data visualization with your actual program data. But what we're doing here, and what I want you to take away as part of this step 4, is just thinking from the start about how you'd like to present the data down the line. So even if you don't have that data yet, in order to convey the story you want to tell, you should have an idea of how you actually want to share that message, and data visualization is a really important way to do that. It's also the first step in setting up what's often called a data dashboard, or a visual representation of your data that is updated over time and you can refer to throughout your program, which is something we're going to talk about here under step 5. So once you know the story you want to tell, the data you need, how you want to present, you want to make sure your database actually is able to do that. So you need to structure your data effectively to tell that story in a timely manner. If you're using an electronic database, this may involve developing customized reports or dashboards that give you that key information you need about your programs. Jeff talked about an example of naturalization in countries of origin, pulling that report so you have that information that you need to tell that story. In customizing reports, just keep in mind those questions that you want to be able to answer so that the reports can help you answer them. And then once you determine this, think through how you're going to analyze and visualize that data. So ensuring that your data collection tools, your surveys and forms, the data entry fields that your staff are inputting into the database are actually enabling you to collect the data, to generate the needed report, and have that report be analyzed and shared as a story. And then for those of you who are using a Microsoft Excel database, we have some recommendations for how to structure Microsoft Excel. This is a totally fictional example of some naturalization services data. And you can see we've kind of laid out a spreadsheet with 3 tabs here on the bottom, because one thing I want to stress is there are some basic ways to structure database that can make your life easier. So one, I recommend separating out your services data or your individual participant data on a detail tab, a detail sheet, so that it's not mixed with any other type of tables or aggregate data that you're summarizing. So in this case, you simply have all of the clients listed as rows, and then all of your variables, the location, the client alien number, et cetera, listed as columns. So this can be very easily analyzed, easily manipulated for your ability to answer those questions and tell those stories. I would also recommend making sure your cells contain clean values. So in all cases, either a text value or a numeric value, not mixing those. Where text is used, ensuring consistent spelling by a controlled list with a drop-down menu. That's just a quick tip that once you implement it, you can avoid people, writing out those application numbers differently, for example. And then lastly, we recommend setting up a data dashboard. So what does that look like? We'll look at just a slide or two. And before we get there, I'll show an example of that aggregate table I mentioned. This can be a separate tab, and it'll automatically pull from your services detail tab with formulas in Excel. It's very simple to do. And then at a glance, when someone asks you, hey, how many naturalization applications did we file, you can compare it to what you did last year. You can see where you are. It's very straightforward for data analysis. But even better, of course, is visualization. So here's a third sheet that you might have in your Excel database where you're visualizing your data so that as you update that services tab, you can see the change just automatically over time. Again, not something you have to recreate whenever you're pulling your data, but if you link the services data into your automatically updating dashboards, these will just change as your activities change, as your different client information is entered. So we talked about the thermometer graph earlier. I didn't show that one here, but just a few other examples of things you may want to track and then use to get a quick look at where your program is. We do this actually for Meta's outcomes and indicators, and we find it really helpful. So here I'll just take a moment to summarize the 5 steps Jeff and I have covered today. I really encourage you to get excited about your database, what it holds, what questions it can help you answer. Here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps we talked about today. First, defining your monitoring and evaluation questions. Second, determining what data can be used to answer them, prioritizing the data that you need to have and the data that's feasible within your resource limitations to collect. Determining where you can get that data, and then planning how you want to present it, making sure you're telling stories that are digestible, that people are excited to hear, and that they can then share that story with others, right? Especially if you are giving them visualizations that they can easily take away. And then lastly, ensuring that your data management structure, whether it's a database, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet, is enabling you to tell your story. So those are the 5 steps that we covered today. I want to thank Jeff for helping present this webinar, and I want to now open it up to anyone who has questions. I really invite you to share with us what your questions might be. So I'll pause for a moment here and look to see if we received any questions over the chat. Okay, great, thank you. I did see a couple come in. One I will answer now. I did hear a question on what kind of data visualization tools do you use most often. Let me know if I'm interpreting this correctly, but we don't use any data visualization software aside from Microsoft Excel, because we know that that's what most of us have on hand. And with a little bit of tweaking, playing around with the format, you can make Excel do, most of the time what you need. The examples I just showed were all created in Microsoft Excel, nothing expensive, nothing fancy. Another question, and Jeff, I'll unmute you actually, and maybe you can answer this one, is we talked about how there are many different data points that you want to collect, and sometimes there are too many. Do you have any recommendations for a program that may be smaller or have more limited resources in just sorting through all the things that require collect and really making some of those choices?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you want to be able to document need in your community so that funders are always aware what the needs are, and then document what type of services you provide and why to fit the need, and then ask clients, why did you choose us? Maybe you're the only game in town, but still, that's an answer. You're the only place I can go, as opposed to agency B or C. And then what services are you providing, particularly in a legal context? What services are you providing? And how successful are you? Are your clients obtaining the benefits that they're seeking? And then finally, what are they doing with those benefits? I think if you track those, I think those were 5, you've really created a circle of data. Need, your response, why us, what you provided, and how successful were you in getting the benefit the client wanted, and then what are they doing with that benefit? How has their life changed and improved? That's a nice simple circle of data points.
Great, thank you. And that one actually leads right into the next question we received, which was, how do you collect information on what clients do after they've left your services? So I know we mentioned registering to vote or buying a house. I'll start off and say one thing you can always do, as Jeff mentioned, sending out a follow-up survey, like a client satisfaction survey that could answer, ask some of these questions. Or as well, if you are, as an agency, providing other services, like in the house buying example, you may be providing an IDA or individual development account program that you could then have that data tracked for to answer this question too. But Jeff, do you have any other thoughts on how you follow up with clients, some of these longer term outcomes after they have left the immediate service period?
Sure. Well, hopefully you're capturing your client's email address. If they don't have one, give them one. Their cell phone numbers, secondary contact information. For example, if they move to another state, who's the secondary contact information? Who would know where they are? So maybe it's a brother who doesn't move, but he knows where his brother moved, where his sister moved. And then you can do texting surveys. You can do online surveys with a link like SurveyMonkey. You can have volunteers create the survey and administer the survey, particularly if that's a school project. That would be good for them, good for the student. It might be a school of public policy. Maybe there's a class that does research in the public sphere that would want to do this project for you. Could be a board member. It could be a volunteer committee. Could be an AmeriCorps volunteer. So it doesn't have to be the program director. And you don't have to survey everyone. You could hopefully contact 20% of your clients, and maybe if it's representational of your clients, 20% is a good enough rate for you to have representational data. So you don't have to demand it from everyone, and then you might have an incentive. If you respond to this survey, your name will be drawn from a lottery, and the prize is whatever donated prize you get. So those are just some ideas.
Great, thank you. And I'll put in a plug too for Meta, another plug for us, because if this is a question that you are trying to answer, what is the best data collection method to answer the, the questions I want to answer, that would be something we would love to, work through with you and see where we can help if we can. I noticed that we are at the hour mark, so again, I want to thank everybody so much for joining and thank Jeff as well for presenting today. If we didn't get to your question, don't hesitate to email us at meta@rescue.org and we will be sure to answer it. You can also find the recording of this webinar as well as a tip sheet that summarizes the content at metasupport.org. We'll get that up if we have a chance to post it. All right, with that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you again, everyone.